book sign. It's just a card. All right. Hello, everyone. Hello. We are here. The final hurdle, the final conversation of the day. I don't know about you. I'm pretty fried, but I was pretty fried earlier, so maybe we're just. It's getting better. I did catnap during the first 10 minutes of Ben's talk. Thank you, Ben. It was very soothing. But then you kept saying interesting things, and so I was like, oh, I'm so tired. I have to. Oh no. I want to. Oh, that's. Oh no. I have to go back to sleep. It was great. I didn't actually fall asleep because it was too good. But I am a little happier now. So. To round out the day, I wasn't sure if we were going to start or end with this subject, but I think it is a good, broad thing to talk about. We've kind of gone into a lot of the nitty-gritty details on how comics get made, how you pitch them, how you sell them. This is slightly in contrast to my previous talk, which is very much concerned with the financial aspect of things. And I have been wanting to give this talk for a long time, and in some ways I have been giving this talk for a long time, which is about how we define success for ourselves in our creative endeavors, in our lives, as freelancers, as family members, whatever. And I mentioned earlier that I spoke at this festival, XOXO, and I gave a talk about having this very public Kickstarter, having gotten an agent, going on book tour, doing all this stuff, and repeatedly people kept telling me, wow, you're a success. You made it. You're having so much fun. And when I was talking to a friend of mine about this, she said, oh yeah, people look at my Instagram posts and always keep telling me what a good time I'm having. I'm miserable. But there is this discrepancy, right, between these two things. And when I gave that talk, I was kind of at breaking point where I didn't know how to talk about the fact that I did feel successful, but not necessarily for the reasons that people were pointing to, and I just felt like the external perception of what was happening in my life was forming this barrier between me and the people that I wanted to connect with, my audience, the people who were most important to me. So this is a slightly more evolved version of that conversation, maybe taking into account some of the things I've learned since I got up and gave a talk that was very raw and very just like, I can't figure out how to talk to any individual in my life about this, so I'll tell 800 people at once on stage. That will probably go over really well. And it did, miraculously. It was actually very beautiful and led to, I think, one of the reasons I ended up doing 100 Demon Dialogues as a book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but initially, I think there are some things that we can all agree look like success for creative people, right? This is one of my most successful artworks. Early work, but I think very sophisticated. This came about when someone asked me when I got into tall ships and sailing. They were like, why are you so into this thing that you're into? It's a little weird. And I said, oh, I got into it in middle school. And then I went home for a visit, and it was like, I don't know, like the end of Memento. This is a very timely reference, not really. Where like the guy finds out that he's actually the murderer, and he's been trying to solve the murder, and like, I was going through boxes and I started finding, coloring books full of tall ships from when I was 6, and like an essay I wrote in the 4th grade called What I Learned from Building a Boat, and it was like, oh God, it goes all the way down. And then I found a lot of these illustrations. Unfortunately, I didn't quite grasp that SS stands for steamship. It should be SV for sailing vessel. Although maybe the steam is this weird little cloud at the backside, I'm not sure. I do also appreciate this heart-shaped starfish in a top hat. Which is underneath there, which I think is quite good. It has fingers, it's good. But this is the kind of thing that people love seeing, right? It's like, I started here, and I went to here! And like, success, I'm done, it's finished. And that's not really how having a creative practice works. You are always going to be renegotiating your relationship to your art. But I think exercises like this are really valuable. If you have old sketchbooks, Ben showed that wonderful stack of all of his things, and there were gasps of horror, awe, appreciation, God knows, shame, fear, but it's amazing to have that resource to go back to, because there is a thing that I read recently that I find to be very true, that was written by not an artist at all, a guy who works in programming named John Salvatore, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, and he wrote an essay about building stairs. and how there is a surprising amount of detail in the act of building stairs. Initially you think, oh, it's just a couple of planks and some bits in the middle, and then you start getting into building them, and it's like there's trigonometry, and everything gets very complicated, and then you put the one thing in, but that means you change how you do the other thing. But then at the end, you look at them, and you're like, oh yeah, I just built those stairs. And the point of the essay was that when you don't know something, it's invisible to you. You don't know the shape of what you don't know. So you don't even know what relevant details to look for because you can't see them. The problem is that once you learn them, they also become invisible. The knowledge that we have gained, that we have been successful in incorporating into our creative practices, is also intangible. It's like you learn to ride a bicycle, but could you enumerate to somebody else what the realizations were that allowed you to gain the balance and proprioception necessary to balance on a bicycle? I certainly can't. I just remember there was a time where I said, I'm never gonna ride a bicycle! And now I ride a bicycle. Something happened, and this is like the talk from before, there's just a lot of question marks in the middle there. So anyway, I put that into your brains as a thought experiment because I think a lot of feeling successful involves cultivating an appreciation for gaining those details, holding them in your mind, rather than just letting them pass into the invisible obscurity of skills that you have, that you've always had, right? That plays into the myth of talent. I think this image is a really great example of why talent is bunkum. This is not talent, this is practice. And I think art is a practice. And when people come up, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, if you're out making art in a public space and people say, oh, I could never do that. I'm not talented. I'm not creative. Like, shit. People are creative, like we make things with our hands. And I think it's just that we are told that we are not because it is hard. And like the idea is that it should be easy. It is not easy. It is pleasurable, but it takes effort, and I think that's a good thing to remember. So when we talk about success, where do definitions of success even come from, right? Like how do they come into our worlds? Well, it's something we start to internalize before we're even really verbal, right? It's in our families. We learn about success from our parents. We learn about success from the culture that we're raised in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. Success means different things. That extends to your religion. It extends to the media you consume. It extends to your peers as you get older. It's just generally the societal matrix that you're embedded in is telling you what success means long before you have an opportunity to define it for yourself, right? And the thing that is clearly missing from this list is you. When are you given the opportunity to define for yourself what success looks like? For many of us in this country, schooling is kind of held aloft as the thing you have to do. Why do you go to college? Well, because that's why. That's what you do. It's the done thing. And anytime there is that emphasis on the done thing, I think it's valuable to take a step back and just question why you want to be doing it. And it may very well be, right? There are two schools of artists that I encounter in my life, of creators in general, and there are people who had incredibly supportive mentors or parents or community members when they were young, who told them that they could do things, and those who had really awful, shitty community members who told them that they couldn't. And both of them are equally driven to make great art. Because one camp of people is like, I'm gonna stick it to the man, I'm gonna show them, and the other one is like, I can do anything, I don't have to worry about not being good enough. There are, of course, other classes of people, right? I'm talking about the people I've met who have gone on to make art. More heartbreaking is all of those people who are going around saying, I'm not creative because my bitter art teacher when I was 7 told me that I would never draw a good line in my life. Or that I did fan art and my professor in college told me that that was not legitimate comics, or that manga is not a reasonable thing for an artist to be working on. Like, it's just, all of it is such malarkey. So in the same way that earlier I was talking about my friend Lillian's concept of budgets being sets of values, I think this is also true for success, right? It's just a different value set. And we all have different ones. And again, much like with money, it's going to change from person to person. So that's really what I want to dive into today to talk about. And if we're just accepting the vague cultural definition, often that can lead to this discrepancy where we're feeling unfulfilled or confused or sad or hollow, and it's like, I don't want to feel like that. I'm sure none of you do either. We get into this because the work nourishes us, right? And so I'm going to go through some different forms of success that I have kind of aspired to. Back when I did my first, I didn't even know that this was a book tour. It was just like my first event at a bookstore, and I had just gotten done. This is from a comic I did about being invited to sail on the last wooden whaling ship in the world, the Charles W. Morgan, which is usually held at Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. And because I have a reputation for making comics about going on adventures and liking tall ships, I got this magical email out of the blue saying, again, this is why you put these things on your website. Because then people see that and they're like, oh, isn't there some girl who likes doing that? We should email her. And when you get an email saying, hey, do you want to sail on this whaling ship from 1871 or whatever that we're taking out for the first time in 92 years, like, you say yes, and then you go, and then you make comics about it, and it's great. But at the end of that trip, I got to go to Trident Booksellers in Boston and do this event. And I was petrified because I hadn't done like an actual bookstore event before. And having done many of them now, I can say that they did an incredible job because there was my name on the chalkboard. It was on the A-frame outside, it was on the chalkboard behind the counter, and then in the little cafe, they had a flyer on the menu, and then they had a flyer in the bathroom, which was like the best part. But these people who came, like, I didn't just draw very few people in this panel because I was feeling lazy, although that was part of it, and these panels were very small. It was also that there were only about 10 people who came. And I think when we talk about events or we talk about tours, you know, especially with the word touring, when I say touring, generally people are like, oh yeah, Stadium Arena Guns N' Roses touring. Like, traveling on a leopard print bus touring, you know, like sitting in a jacuzzi with you. Colleen did reveal that if you ask, most hotels will give you bathrobes, and that she received one that was leopard print with like bell sleeves. And now I have to go immediately. Actually, the talk is over, so I can go ask our hotel if they have any of those. But I think there's this real value to lowering your expectations, which seems like a bad thing to say to an aspirational young person who's like, I want to make comics! And you're like, lower your expectations, kid. But like, seriously, it is actually the unofficial motto of XOXO, the conference that I spoke at, which seems wild because, you know, over 1,000 people attend, and like there are these big main stage talks, and it was actually pretty difficult to have that be my first big talk because it was so cathartic and intense, and like, it's not every talk is going to be an auditorium of like 800 people giving you a standing ovation, and that's hard to adjust from. But this event really stood out to me because it was like 10 people that I mostly knew, and every single one of the people, and the people that I didn't know super well, some of them I just met at a comics meetup, and it was like, oh, you came, like what a gift that you bothered to come after you met me 2 nights ago because I dropped into your comics meetup. And it wasn't so much that it was, you know, blockbuster sales or accolades, it was just nice. It felt like my expectations were reasonably met by the thing that happened. And it turns out that actually this is the case. Your expectations are going to determine the level of satisfaction with the work that you do. Constantly, across the board. And the tricky thing about this is that those expectations will change over time, and your ability to meet them will change over time. I was giving Ben a finger wag over lunch because I was going to use that Ira Glass quote that he shared. But it's okay because I have a complementary graph that we'll talk about. But this is basically, if you want a thesis, like if you want a slide to take a photograph of, this is it. I think it is really important to remember. So the thing to keep in mind with the Ira Glass quote is this idea that creative work has seasons. And that both applies to conceptualizing different times of year when you are either promoting or creating, or selling and prepping for selling. Like Ben beautifully went through all of the stages of creating a graphic novel. There are really nice rhythms to that, and it can be distressing if you have the expectation that you're supposed to be creating work all through the year, up to and including the time when you're on tour, traveling from city to city, and you haven't been home in 6 weeks, and like, how are you supposed to find time to draw comics when you're doing all of that? Oh right, it's the selling season. You're not supposed to be drawing comics. And this makes a lot of sense when we think about it from the perspective of farming, right? You would not yell at a farmer for not harvesting in the dead of winter. There is nothing to harvest. The fields lie fallow before you. They are barren. But they're not barren. There are things happening under the earth. And this has also been really important for me to recognize as a doer, as a person who always likes to be busy. It would be nice if convention season were a thing, but it turns out that there's an event every month of the year, multiple times for every month of the year. So you can't just say, oh, all the comics shows are in the summer. You have to kind of define those seasons for yourself. And they may be different for you. Maybe you're someone who likes to get the heck out of the house in winter, you don't want to be where it's cold, you want to go on vacation, you want to do stuff. But maybe that's your time to hibernate and go inward and think about the work that you want to be doing. So the graph that I first saw, which it doesn't necessarily have to be super legible, but you can see the basic gist of the thing. This is exactly what that Ira Glass quote is about, is that you have two axes, your ability and time. And ability is a relationship between your skill and your taste. And so this intersection is what Ira Glass is talking about, right? There are times when your skill at making art exceeds your taste, and those are the days where you look at the page and you're like, my God, I'm a genius. And then your skill at evaluating art, as it's listed here, your taste, surpasses your skill at making art, and those are the days where you look at your sketchbook and you go, my God, I'm a failure. And those two things are just gonna like keep going back and forth, in and out, forever and ever, and oh God, you're gonna have highs and lows for the rest of time. But the thing that I find so comforting about this graph is that it is a cycle. It is a practice. And if all of us gave up the first time we hit a block and ran into one of those times when it's not that everything about us is bad, it's just that our perception actually got better and our skill is working to catch up. And I think if our visual, practical skills, our hand-eye coordination isn't stacking up, we're very quick to drop the ball and just say, well, that's the end of that. Not doing any more of that. Especially difficult for people, millennials, I'll just come out and say it, who were told that they were naturally good at things when they were young. And then when they ran into difficulty doing those things, were like, it must be because I'm bad, and then ran away and stopped doing those things. I'm actually really very proud that I've kept at comics for this long because I did a lot of other stuff that people told me I was good at when I was young, and noticed this trend where when I hit the point of like, oh, I actually have to stick it out through the less fun parts if I want to get really good at this, not just like passively talented good at it. And I would change tacks, I would do something else. And the good news is that all those skills came back around into comics, which is very helpful. Okay, so this is a panel from 100 Demon Dialogues. This is kind of the gist of what these comics were like. It's conversations between me and my inner critic. And usually, when we are trying to make creative work, this is what the mantra sounds like. For many of us, is that you just have a voice on your shoulder telling you that you're not doing enough, you've gotten nothing done, you need to work harder. And this is kind of that obfuscation I was talking about, right? Like this voice doesn't recognize anything you've done before now. It just wants you to keep doing more into the future. It's never enough, always more. So there are a couple questions you can ask yourself when you invalidate your own accomplishments. And this comes up in one of two times, right? Either you're dealing with your own work and the voice in your head is telling you this, or someone else pays you a compliment and you immediately deflect. You are a ninja of compliments. No one is ever going to touch you with anything that suggests that you might be good at what you do. How could they if you're too fast? And then you have to stop and ask yourself a couple of questions, right? Who put that thought into your brain? Is it your parents telling you that being an artist isn't a real job? Is it that art teacher telling you that you're never going to draw another good line in your life? But then also, what is that thought trying to protect you from? What would it feel like if somebody paid you a compliment and you looked them in the eye and said, thank you. I appreciate that. I've been working very hard at this. And you can ask yourself where you feel it in your body. Because for a lot of us, this discomfort, this immediate sort of, it's not good enough and I have to keep working, and like you're hiding something. And I think connecting bodily awareness to creative awareness is one of the most powerful things we can do, especially as people who sit in front of computers or at drawing tables all day. And then also, who is it serving? Sometimes the voices that are in our head that tell us not to do those things are a function of elements in culture that want to prevent us from being our best and most authentic selves. And this especially applies to those of you who have particularly existed under the tyrannical heel of patriarchy or systemic racism or any kind of injustice, of which there are many in this country. And people get impacted by that in all different kinds of ways, right? It could be your financial background, it could be your cultural background, your religious background, just so many different things. And this is just like basic critical thinking. You don't have to write a dissertation about it, you don't need to like have footnotes. It's just worth asking sometimes. And a lot of the times those questions don't turn into answers for a long time. But there's a wonderful Rainer Maria Rilke quote about living the questions rather than attempting to find the answers, because that's all we can do is just keep asking. So as I started to work through this talk, I was thinking about these two different parameters, right? How do you want to feel because of the work that you do, and then what do you want to have? And it's like this sort of intrinsic, extrinsic dichotomy, I suppose. So there are some realms that I tried to kind of break this down. They didn't end up, I really wanted to make like a, a square statistics people help. Are there any statistics people in the room? God, where's a statistician when you need one? This is like the four plot where you can kind of, anyway. So there's, the rough categories that I came up with were emotional, communal, material, and external, which you can argue about that. But emotional, I think about being like the way that you feel, right? That's like you have accomplishments, you feel proud of your work, you have a job satisfaction, you feel fulfilled. In a communal sense, you are connecting deeply with an audience, so maybe that's like tour events or teaching opportunities, you're having an impact. People send you an email saying like, hey, I read your book and I changed my life because of it, which is like probably the most amazing thing that can happen. And then there are material concerns, right? Maybe success to you feels like improving your quality of life. And this spectrum is very broad, right? I've been polling people while I've been writing this talk. Everyone I run into, what's your definition of success? What's your definition? Where does that come from? What did your father tell you when you were young? I'm great at parties. Please invite me to some. So your quality of life could be anything from like, don't be poor, is what some people told me. They were like, well, as long as I don't live in a trailer park, that's success, because that's where my family lived when I was growing up. Or you talk to people and they're like, I want 5 yachts. Nothing less will do. But ultimately, when you talk to people about this stuff, it's like material success really just means freedom, right? Freedom to choose how you spend your time. A lot of people I asked said that success to them felt like being able to choose to spend more time with their family, not having to be working all the time. And it's stability. It's the built-in cushion that means that if you have an unexpected business expense or a health expense, something goes wrong, you get stranded, you can solve that problem with money without panicking. And then external success, which I think is generally what a lot of us actually, this is the one, right? When you ask people what does being successful look like, and you say New York Times bestseller, Caldecott winner, Newbery winner, you get a starred review, everybody likes you, you're quoted in a big article. There's demand, right? Like something that felt extremely successful to me after last year, planning my book tour involved pitching store after museum after library after wherever, anywhere. I had this huge spreadsheet of places and I wrote endless emails saying, hi, I'm a cartoonist based in Portland, I would really love to come. Hi, I'm a cartoonist based in Portland. Hi, I have this book. And so many people who got back to me were like, what do you do? Like, I mean, maybe. And like, I was pushing to get my events onto calendars and out in the world, and I'm very grateful to all the places that ended up having me because it was a great tour and I met so many good people and got to see so many good tour stops that now I know where to go, right? If I go back to those places. But for this event, I got an email from Amy that said, hey, we would love to fly you out to this event, where you're going to give a talk, to a lot of engaged, committed people who are going to show up specifically to learn about comics, and we're going to pay you. It is not like this for me a lot of the time. And that's fine. Most of the time I love talking, I love seeing people, I love traveling, so I will do these things for next to nothing because I enjoy it. But that, to me, was like, oh, somebody external to me is recognizing that I have something of value to say in this context. And like that does feel like external success, which is really wonderful. So I thank you all for giving me the gift of feeling like a little bit more of a legit presenter than I was 6 months ago. It's okay, hold your applause, because the bad stuff is coming. This is what it boils down to, right? The visible external success. But I want to talk about all the other parts of success. Now, the only way, actually, you know what, I think I can read this off the slide. So I wanted to share this with you just because I got to thinking about it, and I don't necessarily know that it's distinctly related to what we're talking about, but Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a wonderful essay, it's very brief, called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And you can find it online, you can Google it, there's a PDF, I highly recommend reading the whole thing. But I wanted to read this passage because I think it relates to the themes of practice that are coming up. So I can read it off my iPad. I was going to make you all close your eyes. If you would still like to close your eyes, I invite you to do so.
What's the name of it again?
The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction.
Thank you.
Yes. So she has opened this passage talking about how back when we lived in hunter-gatherer societies, usually an average participant in that culture could gather all the food that they needed in about 15 hours a week. She writes, 15 hours a week for subsistence leaves a lot of time for other things. So much time that maybe the restless ones who didn't have a baby around to enlighten their life, or skill in making or cooking or singing, or very interesting thoughts to think, decided to slope off and hunt mammoths. The skillful hunters would then come staggering back with a load of meat, a lot of ivory, and a story. It wasn't the meat that made the difference. It was the story. It is hard to tell a really gripping tale of how I wrestled an oat seed out from its husk, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then I scratched my gnat bites, and then Ool said something funny, and then we went to the creek and got a drink and watched newts for a while. And then I found another patch of oats. No, it does not compare, it cannot compare with how I thrust my spear deep into the titanic hairy flank while Oob, impaled on one huge sweeping tusk, writhed screaming and blood spurted everywhere in crimson torrents, and Boob was crushed to jelly when the mammoth fell on him as I shot my unerring arrow straight through the eye to the brain. That story not only has action, it has a hero. Heroes are powerful. Before you know it, the men and women of the wild oat patch and their kids and the skills of the makers and the thoughts of the thoughtful and the songs of the singers are all part of it, have all been pressed into service in Tale of the Hero. But it isn't their story, it is his. And I really love the thing that she sets up here, right, is that there are two types of tales. And that this heroic, thrusting, stabbing, bloody, drama, whatever story actually is not necessary for the survival of culture. The thing that comes before, the thing that she enumerates in the essay, is this notion of stories as containers, as things that we use to hold values, memories, thoughts, emotions. She describes the different types of containers in our culture, that a home is a type of container, right? That it's not just rooms, it's social circles, it's communities. And these spaces that we occupy, that we fill up with things that are meaningful to us, change the way that we perceive value in the world, which I think can feel very threatening to someone, like a hero, who is very invested in that particular type of storytelling. And it's not to say that stories with heroes are bad, right? There are plenty of wonderful stories with heroes. But there is, it's not on my next slide, now I'm panicking. Oh, look, okay, here. This is my favorite part. Finally, it is clear that the hero does not look well in this bag. He needs a stage or a pedestal or a pinnacle. You put him in a bag and he looks like a rabbit, like a potato. Which I find wonderful, just like, it's the least attractive space. So this, I think the story of the singular hero is kind of like talking about the story of just making it to the New York Times bestseller list, and that's it, you hacked and slashed and stabbed, and then you were there, and you did it, and then you're successful forever. And I stumbled across this wonderful Twitter thread the other week from an author who I was not previously familiar with, and I don't know how to pronounce their name. Anybody?
Lee Bardugo.
Lee? Yeah. Great. Okay, Lee Bardugo, who had some books that were on the bestseller list and had written about what it had taken to get there, and had some really beautiful insights about it, including the fact that it often really depends on what week your book is published. If your book comes out the same week as the newest Harry Potter, guess what? You're plumb out of luck, because like, that spot is already taken. There are people, intelligent, smart, handsome people like Ryan North, who's coming up a lot in this presentation. I think you should get him next time to speak. And he's 3 times the size of me, so he would just be all of us. He's very tall, very handsome. And Ryan worked on a project with David Malky, another cartoonist, and they staged a coordinated campaign amongst their readers and said, okay, on this day, at this time, on this platform, you are all going to go and pre-order this book, and that is going to put it on the New York Times bestseller list. And I believe, Colleen, didn't you try to do something similar for a project to like surprise your mother?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're always like, I looked at the New York Times and you're not there.
and
And I was like, I'm never going to be there, Mom. Right, I did it. And actually, I was part of Machine of Death. I was in the audiobook.
Oh, great! Oh my God. Okay, well, we should talk about that more later. So yeah, there are like strategies you can employ. But this quote was the one that really stood out to me. That she says, "A week on the list does not make a career. A wildly successful first book does not make a career. A wildly successful first series does not make a career." I don't think anyone wants to hear that. We want to believe in a single magical moment of stabbing, blood, gore, mammoth ascendance, right? Like that's what it is. And in actuality, the thing that she describes in the thread is that it is picking a wild oat and another wild oat and another wild oat, and like that does not gel with the way that we as a culture conceptualize success and victory. And it can be really hard if you're in a world that's like, where's your mammoth stabbing? And you're like, well, I've been picking oats for the last 6 months. It's pretty boring. And I saw a bird yesterday, and it was cool. Okay, so this brings me to the point that I want to talk about, which is bread. So this image cracks me up. I was very excited when I found this, because this is like, when you think of Wonder Bread, right, it's synonymous with like vapid, sort of empty calories, like it's just white bread, it's actually been leached of nutrients, and yet it is enriched. Enriched with what, one might ask? I'm not really sure. And I saw this image and was like, okay, well, I was trying to find a photo of something like white bread to be like, oh, this is a, you know, not enriched thing. But then I saw this word and was like, okay, well, what's the definition of enriched, right? And you have two options here, and I think they really sum up the conundrum. One is to improve or enhance the quality or value of, and the other one is to make someone wealthy or wealthier. And like, there it is, right? Our emotional material dichotomy. Working between things that make us feel good and then things that make us materially better off. And I don't know, I just like this slide, I guess. I just like the bread thing. It was pretty instrumental in the talk that I gave about being on food stamps, because food stamps, right? And like wanting to have work that nourishes both you and your audience. And I think for me, I guess the crux of why I put these images up is that I do find that I am more driven by making an impact, by those intrinsic values, than I am by external recognition. Now, do I still want external recognition and huge bags of money? Yes, I do. It is not wrong or bad to want those things, let us recall. But it's also, again, as part of adjusting your expectations reasonably, I have to fight constantly to remind myself that that is what I value. Because the world keeps saying, Wonder Bread, and I'm like, no, it's vegetables, vegetables. And it's hard to like push back and make a little circle and decide to say, I really want to just touch a couple people. And if I connect with a couple people, I will feel like a success. If I connect with one other person, right? Because if your expectations are really low, if your Kickstarter goal is really low, you're gonna feel like a success because you're overshooting it by a huge margin. And this has come up time and time again, especially as I've produced my own books, because I start to buy into the hype. When I was producing Demon Dialogues and the book was getting ready to come out, I was having, you know, fantasies of bestseller lists dancing before my eyes. And Baggy Wrinkles had received a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which I was very excited about, as an independent publisher specifically. And Demon Dialogues did not. It was reviewed by somebody who did not get the premise of the book at all and was like, weird gag book, something, something, blah. And I was heartbroken. I was like, oh God, it's all over for me now. But I talked to a friend of mine who used this comparison, and I'm trying to find like a more agnostic maybe way to talk about this. But she said, think about this book as a gospel, right? It's something that spreads because a person reads it and it moves them, and they hand one copy to another person. And that connection is more human and more meaningful than being on every end cap in every national chain and having people just pick up a book because it's trendy. Like, what if you focus on trying to make something that people will want to hand to each other and say, this will help. You will feel seen in this book. And she really changed my mental perception of what I was going after on my tour, and I tried to keep coming back to that. Because anytime I would plan an event, I would think, oh God, Guns N' Roses, but leopard print bus, there have to be 80 people or it's a failure. And so over time, I just had to drill it into myself, like 5 people. If 5 people come, the fewer people who come, the deeper the conversation I can have with them, right? Why not? So the trouble with all of this is that, okay, you've asked yourself all these questions, you've picked apart your heredity, you've figured out what your definition of success is. Bad news, it's going to change. Possibly as soon as next week, so get it while you can. And I came across this quote the other day that I really loved in a book by Sarah Manguso called Ongoingness. And she says, I no longer believe in anything other than the middle, but my students still believe in beginnings. Ask them and they will tell you that everything is just about to start in just a moment. Just one more moment. And there is this sense where believing that success is a singular destination feels like that. You're like, oh, I'm not, again, the invisibility of all that's come before you, right? It's like you're climbing a mountain and the trail has washed out right before the summit. And so you take that one last leap And then somehow your brain erases the 9 miles of hiking that you did and is like, did you see that? I just jumped from the ground all the way to the top of this mountain. Killing it. That's not how that works. And this happens to me all the time. Every time I accomplish something. Here's another panel from the book. Day 77, so like, I was doing a lot.
Can you put the,
Oh, God.
yeah, just for a second.
There you go. So the following panel is me having overcome an obstacle course and saying, at last, victory is mine! And my demon is saying, whoops, I moved the goalpost again. Which is what it feels like. Every time you accomplish a goal, you think, you know, okay, when I get here, that'll be enough. No more after that. Or when I get here, that's going to be enough. No more after that. But the problem is that there is always something more to do. Except, how is that a problem? If there's always something more, doesn't that mean you're still alive? Like, stasis is death. Change is being alive. Surely the idea of being alive is more appealing than the idea of being unchanging forever, unless you're really into vampires. Which many people are. It's a very popular way to get on the bestseller list, I hear. Okay, are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this sense of like the ground is going to shift out from under you, right? You are always struggling to make your way into the world where you have done enough. And the question is, how can you do enough without arriving in a place of frozen, sort of chrysalis, suspended in amber stasis? Because then you're not growing, you're not changing. Like, this is part of who we are. And I want to be very careful that we're not equating never doing enough or being enough with who we are as human beings, because that's not right. Like, I don't want that to necessarily be the takeaway. But this idea that there are more and more things to learn. I've been thinking a lot recently about this concept that there is research that shows when you encounter new people and situations and places, your perception of time dilates because you are taking in more new information and your brain has to work harder to process. And this is why, as kids, you know, time seems to stretch on forever because everything is new all the time. And so there are two schools of thought here. One is that you can always be traveling, you can always be seeing new things, and in that sense you can live a life many times the length of an average life because you are constantly living in this state of dilated appreciation of time. But the other option there is that you stay put, you stay in the same place, and you pick your oat husk day after day, but you look more deeply into the landscape around you. You perceive new layers of things in what you are showing up to practice. And I think that has the same result. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, it's just nice to know that they're both options. And that if you're not getting to go travel to the ends of the earth, there are still many things you can do to stay put. My next point is perhaps a difficult one for the people who are making creative work in spite of or to spite someone who told them they couldn't do it when they were younger. But that feeling kind of wears off after a while. I've talked to a lot of people who were like, yeah, you know, when I started out, every line that I drew was like, screw you, Mr. Stevens! And then over time, you reach a point where you're like, I have softened toward Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens cannot touch me anymore. I am a successful author on the New York Times bestseller list. Some people nurse that grudge until they die, and like that is their road home. It's fine. But I do very firmly believe, and I think there is science that backs this up, although Lord knows I didn't check it, that running towards something, there are no footnotes in this talk, I'm sorry. Running towards something is always more powerful than running away. So this was my experiment when I set up that financial tracker. I feel like previously, when I didn't have a goal for the year, I was just like, out of poverty, out of poverty, out of poverty, and I wasn't thinking like, towards financial well-being, towards financial well-being. And it feels very different because you're making proactive progress towards a goal that you believe in instead of just running away from something that scares you. And it has definitely changed my understanding of how I'm pursuing success, which turns out that it feels way better. So these are a couple panels from something called Hourly Comic Day, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a holiday every year on February 1st. This was my 7th one, I think, 8th. And the goal is that you wake up and you and thousands of other cartoonists around the world draw a panel for every hour that you are awake, or a couple panels. And I love it because it is an annual snapshot both into my artistic ability, because I draw them every year, and the first one was 7 years ago, so like it was drawn on the back of a napkin with a ballpoint pen, and it's pretty sloppy. And this is last year's, which I had time to watercolor, and you know, every year I make it, and it's like you have a finished comic in a day. It's hard to get a lot of socializing done, This last year I was in a bar waiting for friends and frantically drawing to try and catch up to all the panels I'd missed. The bartender kept trying to talk to me, and he was like, so what are you doing? And I said, oh, Hourly Comic Day, it's this holiday, I'm sorry, I'm behind, I have to keep drawing. And he said, oh, cool, so that's like it's like a vacation, like a holiday, like for your job? And I'm like, the opposite of that thing. But I wanted to put this panel up because it was a year where I was thinking about rituals, and I'm going to talk about a few that I found very helpful in being more mindful of acknowledging my accomplishments. Unfortunately, someone had asked earlier about how much time I spend doing business stuff, and there is also, of course, the dreaded ritual of cleaning out my inbox, and the dreaded ritual of constantly trying to navigate being active on multiple social media platforms and having all these people wanting my attention, which generally just leads to this. But there are longer rituals, right? Someone mentioned Inktober, which is a project where you do an ink drawing for every day of the month of October. It was started by a cartoonist named Jake Parker, who is a wonderful resource for people to follow. He's a very sweet guy, makes a lot of educational videos and helpful materials, and is a whiz at crowdfunding, just like a really good person to know. And for Inktober, gosh, a few years ago, I did a series of watercolors, and you can actually see the fourth watercolor. I think this was the October before I did that Hourly Comic Day painting, because that's the same view that you see in the first panel of that comic where I'm looking out my window. And I would do these watercolor paintings once a day at dusk or dawn, wherever I happened to be, and it was a really meditative way to look at the world around me, and I really liked doing it. And the thing I love about daily drawing projects is that you start out with just, it's like one day at a time, you know, and usually a good daily project is something you can accomplish in less than an hour, ideally. Less than 15 minutes is even better. And it doesn't feel like much, right? Individually, there were paintings in this project that I showed up and was like, I'm garbage, this is awful, or I'm a genius, this is incredible. And I can still remember which ones they were, right? But I also look at the whole and like, I can remember how I felt when I drew them, but when I look at the consistent creative quality, it's like, it's all just art, right? Like it's actually a mind game. And over time, you know, if you extrapolate this from being just a month's worth of art to 3.5 months worth of art, you end up with a whole book. And this is delightful to me because I firmly believe that I don't have the stamina to draw a full graphic novel. Just like, don't have it. There are 2 on the table back there before you correct me. I understand that, but I'm incapable of it. Do you see? You see what I'm getting at here? These 2 things are both true, but this is like a kind of a way to trick yourself. If you're a person who is like, I can't finish anything and it's too hard, just finish one thing, and then maybe finish another thing that's the same format as the first thing. Voluntary sort of experimental projects are a really great way to do that. So we're going to talk about actual nourishing rituals. A couple of things that I found very useful. Keeping a gratitude jar. Speaking of containers, this has been a really lovely way, and I know there are plenty of authors that do this too. I have a folder on my desktop that just says good feelings, and if I get a nice email from a reader, if I see a complimentary tweet, if there is a review that I like, I will screenshot it and put it in that folder. And it may very well be, and many, you know, famous New York Times bestseller artists have done this because it is really helpful on the days when you are just questioning why you even bother, right? Maybe the world is on fire, and you feel like making art is a frivolous and useless thing to do when other things are bad. Maybe you got a bad review and you're like, no one will ever love my work ever again. It's just so easy to erase the things that we do accomplish in this life on any scale. And this doesn't have to be major accomplishments. It can be like, I took a walk this morning and got coffee and it was really nice. Put it in the jar, don't look at it. My last year was my first year doing this, and I dumped all the pieces of paper out on my bed when I got home at the end of the year, and I was gone a lot of the year, so I didn't actually have as many as I thought I would. But reading through them was so beautiful because it's like those moments get encapsulated. It's a bookmark. When you read that slip of paper, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that day, even if you'd forgotten all about it. And you remember walking to get coffee, and you remember the light through the leaves, and you remember all these beautiful details. And it's just a really, again, a lovely way of like extending that time a little bit more. It's also just generally really good to like shed some love on that horrible inner voice that tells you that everything is garbage, even though it will kick and scream and tell you that that is bad. If you're trying to tell it that it's okay and it's safe and you're doing a good job and hey, I love you, and like you're probably gonna get a degree of pushback from your inner critic who's gonna be like, no, you smell, whatever, this is awful, I hate you, ah, God, get off me, this is nice. It's like befriending a cantankerous cat, right? Like, eventually the cat is just like, I guess scratching is good. Oh no, I'm purring. Oh, yeah, okay. So a couple of things that I have found useful for this is thinking about your 9-year-old self. Thinking about young you. And times when I get really down on myself, I feel like I'm not advancing fast enough, I get a lot out of thinking back on the person that I was when I was not doing this for a living. And sometimes you can get that experience by like going and talking to kids, which I think is really helpful, and like talking to kids who look at you like you're some sort of weird, amazing unicorn alien because you come into their class and you draw something on a whiteboard and they're like, what? You just drew that from nothing? You're a wizard? And this actually happened to me recently. I put it in comics because I grew up not feeling like I was a very strong person, physically strong. And I made this comic about having gone to yoga as a more like regular practice over the last couple of years. And I had this experience where I got up one morning and I looked in the mirror and I had this moment of like seeing physical strength in my body in a way that I never had when I was growing up. And I didn't even have to put myself in the headspace of like, let me imagine what it was like to be 9. It just like hit me across the face. And was like, this is it, it's happening right now. Like if I met me when I was that age, I would have the same reaction that I had seeing kids in high school when I was in 7th grade, that I was like, they're so cool and creative, and like, too bad I'm just shy and no one's ever gonna like me, and like, it's tribes, and lots of people have, it's amazing. Things get better, like you become an adult and you have all kinds of control over your life and like unexpected beautiful things happen. And it's really valuable to remember that. And then this is like the cheap shot Mr. Rogers tactic that I'm gonna pull on you. I am gonna do a Mr. Rogers moment here. If you've seen this video, I'm sorry. But Mr. Rogers did a really beautiful thing at, I wanna say it was the Golden Globes maybe, where he asked this room full of very materially successful people, right? People who had trophies and riches and gowns and glitz and like the quintessential Hollywood fame glamour. And rather than talking about, you know, his accomplishments, he asked everybody in the audience to take just 2 minutes to think about someone who had believed in them when they were younger and how proud that person would be of them for making it to where they were right now. So we're gonna do that just for 30 seconds. Just think about somebody who believed in you and think about what you're doing now and how much it must mean to them to see you doing what you're doing. Did that feel nice? Did anybody get a little teary? It's pretty wild. The first time I watched that video and was like, tears were immediately streaming down my face, like he hadn't even started counting. You know, he looked down at his watch and I was like, and like, when is the last time that you stopped and thought about that, thought about how it felt to have somebody who cared about the work that you made? And then to see that you have come a really long way. We spend so much time thinking about all the things that we have yet to do. And there's a lot of time that we forget that behind us is this huge crew of people who believe in us, who believe in what we do. This was a photo that I took at the wrap party for the 100 Demon Dialogues Kickstarter. I invited everyone to come and celebrate together. And I really love this photo because it's not even a fraction of the people who were at the bar. It was like the whole patio. We couldn't fit everyone in the photo. But I think about like all of these faces of people who care about this thing that I'm making and who like wanted to see me succeed, so much so that they supported me on Kickstarter to make it happen. And I just love that. I think it's a beautiful thing. So just to reiterate, I've been doing this for almost a decade, and I think the most important thing I have learned, especially about the stubbornness of continuing to work, which I think is a lovely way of putting it, is to say that it takes stubbornness to keep showing up, is that you have to be careful about not conflating how you are perceived or how you perceive others with the way that you feel. You cannot know somebody else's internal landscape of success, and you cannot know how far along they are in the pursuit of trying to get there, right? In the goal of wanting to be the person that they set out to be. And every time these two areas of my life are in conflict, when people see something that isn't equivalent to what I feel, or when I see something in somebody else and I'm not getting the whole picture, that's where the friction comes from. That's where the misery comes from. And it's like misery that I put on myself. We live in an age where we're encouraged to be on platforms all the time that are built on comparison and not getting the whole story. You know, I said earlier that social media is an act of curation. How many of you have posted a photo of yourself like sobbing to social media and been like, Tuesday? But like, that's my Tuesday, yo. Like, that's how it feels a lot of the time. And I think it's okay to be honest about that stuff. And you don't have to do it, like I said earlier, previous talk, you don't owe anybody that. And that has been really hard. Something that happened last year was that at the start of the year, being in front of people, being really vulnerable, that feeling that I had when I spoke at EXO, felt like success. And I read this book, or maybe this was an article, I can't even remember where this Melody Wilding quote came from, but she said, by pushing myself in the name of getting uncomfortable, I had sacrificed to the point of exhaustion. And I realized that that edge of living in the area of discomfort, of wanting to be brave, to be brave, to be brave, had pushed me to a point where by the end of the year, I was allergic to Instagram. I could not handle my phone. I took off all these social media apps, I put it in airplane mode, I went to see my family, and I just didn't pick it up again for a couple of months. And it really wigged me out because I was like, this is a huge part of my job. It's also something that I go coach people on and tell them to do more of. Is this bad? Am I bad? No. I'm a farmer, and it's winter. So it's time to life out. So the questions to ask yourself, if you see this and you think, success, I don't know, I can't really put my finger on what that feels like, just ask yourself, when do I feel successful? Or when do I feel proud, validated, connected, nourished, whole? When I finished 100 Demon Dialogues, it didn't end the way I had set out to end it. And I didn't have a goal from day one, right? It was an experimental project. But over the course of the project, more and more people kept commenting on all these different social media platforms and saying, wow, this is me. This is like uncomfortably close to me. And every time I posted something that I was like, this is the one, it's not funny at all, it's just really sad and difficult, oh God, here we go. Those were the ones that got the biggest result. People would write and say, this, how? I didn't know anybody else felt this way. And I realized as the project wore on that the thing that was really important to remind people of was this. Spoilers, this is the end of the book. It'll probably still make you cry if you read it though. And these were all people who sent in photographs of themselves. When I requested on Twitter, I said, hey, if you want to participate in a secret thing, send me a picture of yourself. And there's this feeling that by not talking about these ways that we internalize success, the ways that we're falling short, the voices in our heads, where they come from, you know, somebody's supportive parent might be somebody's abusive uncle. Like, it's really hard to know who is listening to what voice. And, you know, the cultural voices we internalize differ so much depending on demographics and everything else, that it's just valuable to remember that this is the thing that unites us, which should be depressing, but for some reason it's not. When I went on tour, I handed out these little name tags. There are some on the table at the back, along with a bunch of postcards, and please take them because I have so many. And they said, hi, my name is so-and-so, and my demon tells me blank. And I went all around the country, and I had people write their name and what their demon told them, and I put that sticker in a guest book. And by the end of the tour, people would ask me, like, how does it feel to be carrying around such an evil artifact? Which made me feel like a necromancer, which was cool. But it was weird to me, because I was like, this isn't an evil artifact. This is a human artifact. This is, I mean, if anything, it's an exorcism, right? The opportunity to take that part of yourself and put it in the light, that is where that voice can't survive. Because all of that is predicated on shame, and shame is predicated on silence. And if we stay silent about the fact that we're struggling, it can be so hard for anybody else to feel. It's not even about, don't be self-serving. You've got to talk about it because someone else needs to hear it too. And then you can come together and you can talk about it together and it'll feel good and that will be nice. I'll tell you one more story and then I'll stop. At Emerald City Comic Con just a couple weeks ago, I was not really doing the stickers thing because usually when I sign books, and I will ask some of you this, so I'll say it now so that you don't panic. There is a demon in the front of the book that is just shouting and stamping his feet. And I usually draw a little word balloon and have the demon say something personalized, like, I don't know, you're never good enough, or you don't have any good ideas. And then I say something nice underneath, so like, don't panic. I'm not just gonna be rude to you and then kick you out the door. You're like, there's your book, don't take a hike. But it was too chaotic, there was too much going on, and like people generally freeze up when I ask at big events, so I was like, don't worry about it. But a woman came by my table towards the end of the day, and she had a copy she already owned. She'd read the book, and she said, oh, I was wondering if you could sign this for me. It was really meaningful. And I was like, of course, thank you so much. And when I asked her, she didn't hesitate. She didn't bat an eye. She just looked at me and said, nobody will ever love you. And then immediately said, that's really dark. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Oh God. And I was about to say something comforting to her, but we had almost sold out of books. And my friend Sarah was tabling with me. And Sarah had brought her copy of the book from home, which I had signed for her 1 year previously. So I didn't remember what I'd written in it. But she opened her copy of the book, and she had asked for the exact same inscription. And it was like, I didn't even have to be there, right? I just wish that I could like disappear into the earth and let these two people have this incredible moment that still gives me goosebumps. Because it was like, that is what art is for, right? Not even in the relationship between author and reader, but in the relationships between each other, right? These little gospels that we spread to each other that say, this makes being human more bearable. And it just is like probably something I will treasure until the day I die, that moment. So I really wish for all of you that you encounter moments on whatever axes of success feel meaningful to you in that same capacity. And thank you so much for your attention and your time. This is my website. This is my handle on social media, which I am begrudgingly on now. So I welcome hearing about your definitions of success or your thoughts about this talk or anything else. And Godspeed to all of you. Thank you.